The Judiciary Committee will come to order, a quorum being present. Having agreed yesterday to the amendment in the nature of a substitute on articles of impeachment against President Donald J. Trump, the pending business is reporting the resolution favorably to the House. Reporting quorum being present, the question is now on the motion to report the resolution H-Res 755 is amended favorably to the House. Pursuant to Clause 5 of House Rule 16, because the resolution contains two distinct propositions, we will divide the question between the two articles. The question now is on Article 1 of the resolution, impeaching President Donald J. Trump for abusing his powers. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen?
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch?
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass?
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Richmond?
Yes.
Mr. Richmond votes yes. Mr. Jeffries?
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings?
Aye.
Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Yes.
Mr. Correa votes yes. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner?
No.
Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
My vote is no.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck?
No.
Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Radcliffe? Mr. Radcliffe votes no. Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates?
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock?
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko?
No.
Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler?
No.
Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong?
No.
Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stube? No. Mr. Stube votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote?
Mr. Chairman, may I ask
Clerk
how
will-
I'm recorded?
How is the gentleman recorded?
Mr. Gomer, you are recorded as no.
Yeah, I want to make sure.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 23 ayes and 17 noes.
The article is agreed to. The question now is on Article 2 of the resolution, impeaching President Donald J. Trump for obstructing Congress. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen?
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch?
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass?
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Richmond?
Yes.
Mr. Richmond votes yes. Mr. Jeffries?
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings?
Aye.
Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Yes.
Mr. Correa votes yes. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? No. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Shabbat? No. Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
No.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? No. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Radcliffe? No. Mr. Radcliffe votes no. Ms. Roby?
No.
Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates?
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock?
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko?
No.
Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler?
No.
Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong?
No.
Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stube?
No.
Mr. Stube votes no.
Is there every member of the committee who wishes to vote voted? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 23 ayes and 17 noes.
The article is agreed to. The resolution as amended is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. The resolution will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.
Mr. Chairman,
For
pursuant
what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
to Clause 2L of Rule 11, I give notice of intent to file dissenting views.
Notice is heard. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.
Anybody else coming? Oh, good. Debbie.
That's good.
I'll just
Talking
start
to her.
off. I'll just start off. Well, this is really a sad day. Big show. Everybody got dressed up, really no place to go. We voted on a provision, an allegation of abuse of power. There was an abuse of power at the Department of Justice. There was an abuse of power at the FBI. There was an abuse of power at the FISA court. There was abuse of power in our intel community. There was abuse of power. Even DOD was paying money to help set up the president. So there were all kinds of abuses of power, perhaps none more so than in the House of Representatives by the majority. This is an outrage. It sets the bar for any president of any party for the future to go through 3 years of hell like this president has. It's really unfortunate. This is a sad day for the country. It's going nowhere in the Senate, but I really hope and pray the Senate will not just pick it up and dismiss it. America needs to hear from the witnesses. And we didn't get to hear from them here. This was a kangaroo court. Outrageous to put the country through this, and we get a report. And we don't even get to examine the maker of the report. So it's a very sad day. I'm just glad I had such an incredible team I got to be on. These are really quality folks. Debbie, you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, this is really a travesty for America, and it's really tearing America apart. I have never in my entire life seen such an unfair, rigged railroad job against the President of the United States. I have known that my fellow Democrats were going to go for impeachment since January of this year when they got power. And here we are today. They predetermined they were going to do it, and they did it, come hell or high water. They had no proof, no evidence, no crime, but they went ahead anyway, and they're tearing the country apart, and they should be ashamed.
The founding fathers, the founders of this country warned against single-party impeachments, and they had a very specific reason for warning us against that. They said that it would be bitterly divisive, perhaps irreparably divisive for the country, and that's what's happened now. This is the first time in the history of this nation, in 243 years, that a president has been treated in this manner, when one party has followed and pursued a predetermined political outcome to get to that end. You have to remember that before the famous July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky that supposedly sparked all of this whole charade, 95 House Democrats had already voted to proceed with impeaching Donald Trump before any of these facts came forward. That's just not right. They determined this. They said it from the day he took his oath of office that they would remove him, and they pursued that end. So this is what we're left with. 14 hours yesterday and a few moments this morning, this anticlimactic end to this whole charade was fitting and appropriate. There wasn't much there, and that's what happened here. I think the American people are going to militate against this. I think the polling shows that they've been very frustrated. They see what's happened here. They see the lack of evidence. They see this paper-thin impeachment proceeding, what ultimately developed of it, that there's nothing behind it. I think we showed that very clearly, and I think there's going to be a huge political price paid by the Democrats at the polls next year. And what we're ultimately concerned about, beyond the price that's paid in this short-term period, is what this is going to do to our republic going forward. The founders were right. They have divided the country even further, and I think that it's going to be very difficult for us in this institution to put this genie back in the bottle, and that's ultimately what we're all so concerned about.
In the media, you should hold the Democrats to the standard that they set for themselves, not the standard they set back in 1998 when Jerry Nadler said that impeachment would have to be supported by substantially a bipartisan group to be legitimate. Look at the standard they set for themselves just a few months ago. Democrats said that the evidence would have to be overwhelming, and yet in hearing after hearing, the evidence they presented was either hearsay, speculation and conjecture, or the result of a policy disagreement about how to treat the Ukraine. Democrats promised that after public hearings, there would be some newfound animated public support for impeachment. The reality is they failed to meet their burden. And so now, with no bipartisanship, matter of fact, the only bipartisan vote will be a bipartisan vote against impeachment. With no direct evidence, with no enhanced public support for impeachment, Democrats will continue to visit the opportunity costs for this division on our country. As Republicans, we would like to work on infrastructure, on asylum reform, on policy changes that will actually impact the quality of life for our constituents. But for Democrats, impeachment is their drug, it is their obsession, it is their total focus, and it is deeply disappointing that they failed to meet the standard that they set for themselves. Questions?
Yeah, Congressman, do you guys worry about the precedent that this sets on obstruction of Congress, the fact that this administration did not comply, did not cooperate at any point with this investigation, which has not happened?
No, the administration has cooperated with fair and reasonable oversight. But when Democrats made clear that this was not about oversight, it was about impeachment, it was about an illegitimate process, then I think that reasonably informed the administration's position on whether or not to validate this absurd process.
Wait a minute.
Both the Nixon and Clinton administrations cooperated or provided some information in their impeachment investigation.
Yes.
Have the charges changing constantly.
Let me address this as we did yesterday. You have to understand that the Trump administration has cooperated. Okay, just this year, they understand Congress's oversight and investigation responsibility, and they've acknowledged it. 25 members of the administration have testified before oversight. 20 have testified before the Judiciary Committee. When the impeachment proceeding began, over 100,000 pages were submitted by the White House to Congress pursuant to our request. And, of course, he immediately released the transcript, the famous transcript of the phone call. The president has not been obstructing this at all. What he's worried about is the process, is this unprecedented charade that's gone on. Adam Schiff controlling this in the basement, having secret hearings, cherry-picking witnesses, denying Republican questions, not allowing Republican witnesses to come forward. There's been no chance for the President's counsel to participate in the early stages of this. This whole thing was rigged. I'm an attorney. Many of us are. If we were advising our client, and our client in this case happened to be Donald Trump, we would tell him not to participate in that because it's an ambush. We got an ambush last night on the scheduling. At every stage of this, the Democrats have tried to railroad the president, and that's why he's had some concern. The fact that they brought an impeachment claim of obstruction is absurd. The Obama administration, the one just prior to this one, went to court. They didn't turn in pleadings and all the documents and witnesses that were requested in the Fast and Furious investigation. They went to the third branch of government. That's the way our system is set up. When there is a natural impasse that develops between the legislative and executive branches, we have the third branch of government, the judiciary. They could have easily gone a few blocks away to a federal court, gotten an order to compel the production of anything else they needed, but they didn't have time to do that. You know why? We all know why. Because they guaranteed to their radical left base that they would impeach Donald Trump by Christmas. That's why we're here. That's why we've done all this, and that's why they didn't go through the normal process, the custom and practice of every previous administration in the modern era.
At the end of the day, the Democrats control the House of Representatives. They can determine what the process is. You guys might not like it. There are politics in this. There were politics in 1999 with President Clinton. We hear what you're saying, but that said, don't they have the right to handle this in the fashion that
They don't
see
have the
fit?
right to abuse the process, and this was a total abusive process. It was a witch hunt. That's why they could not settle on a charge until they had exhausted that there was no evidence of a crime. And let me just tell you, if the DOJ and the FBI went after you and your family and your business associates, harassed them, and you find out, as the president did early on, this was all a scam to bring him down, then you would be wise, and I bet most any attorney would say, don't you go and they're looking for anything. Don't help them crucify you. It would not be smart. The president did the right thing. The obstruction of justice was right here. Well, of course, also DOJ, FBI, but hopefully there'll be people pay for that.
Says that he's not likely to bring forward witnesses in the Senate trial.
That'd be a big mistake.
You have called for witnesses. How do you think that you're actually going to get your story out? This is not what McConnell
The Senate
says
promised that for months now they would have witnesses, and I really understand the desire. This was a ridiculous process, a report, no real witnesses here. So I understand their desire to just get it behind us, but the country needs to hear what a farce this was. They really need to bring in witnesses. They're the chance to clean this mess up, and I sure hope they will.
Congressman, this is a president who just yesterday called a teenager on the autism spectrum a person with an anger management problem. Does that make it harder to defend him this vigorously?
The president communicates in a unique way. He doesn't communicate the way I do and the way many of us would. But wait a minute, let me answer. 63 million Americans voted to make him the president of the United States. He has an unorthodox style, but what we're talking about in here is removing a president because the Democrats don't like that style. They don't like him. They don't like his Twitter account. They don't like many of his staff members. They don't like what he does in the office, but the way our system is designed, the way our Constitution is written, is the party in charge. Even if you have the majority in Congress, you don't get to remove a president because you don't like him. They did not produce a scintilla of evidence to support a charge of impeachment, and that is the question at the end of the day. That's why we're so frustrated. We may not have a trial in the Senate. The president may not get a chance to put on his witnesses and put on his defense, but we're going to do it to our constituents and the American people every opportunity we have. And I don't know. I think that's about it.
Why is it ever okay for an American president to ask a foreign power to investigate a political rival? Why do you think that's okay?
He didn't do that.
He did ask Zelensky.
He did not do that.
Yes. He asked President Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. Why is it okay?
That was because I think logically, more likely than the Democrat story, is because he wanted to vet out the corruption. He had seen the video of Joe Biden bragging about how he was going to withhold $1 billion from Ukraine if they didn't fire the prosecutor, the same prosecutor that had been investigating Burisma, the corrupt company where his son was getting paid to be on the board. That's corruption. That had corruption, plain and simple, according to an Obama administration person on a similar case who said that is corruption, plain and simple. And I think it's the responsibility of the President of the United States, before he hands over taxpayer dollars to investigate corruption, and I believe part of that corruption was with the Bidens.
He never mentioned corruption at all on that phone call.
Do you want witnesses at the Senate trial? Do you agree with that? I would. But they're not all, they may not all be
We're just waiting for him.
You guys, if you're going to do a video, do me a favor. Everybody needs to go back and sort of behind the stage.
That's what we'll try for.
like
Did he ask me? Matt, did you ask me if Jeff was there?
No, not that.
Oh.
Do you see any social?
Yeah, one, but he's just walking.
Well, all right.
I look like Danny.
But they're not talking. Okay, yeah, exactly.
I think that's Jim Paul. Oh,
Usually, yeah, the focus.
All right, thanks.
Get him, Tom. Hey, Brian?
Yeah.
Wait, just me? Yeah, just
Just on your iPhone.
As soon as somebody gets
One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine.
within 5%.
This is just Nadler? Okay, so Nadler's going to full camera, it's 5.
Okay.
What's the Adler's going to go to the camera? 5. Thank you.
If you didn't catch that, Nadler's going for the full camera within 5 minutes. So we're going to ask you to pick your poison. Where's the full
I'm rolling.
Do we have a camera here? Where's that?
Right here.
Actually, can you stand right in the middle? Can you stand right in the middle, please, so we all can get you? Thank you.
Wait, sorry. This, if you could just stand right here. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Has Chairman Adler spoken yet?
Not yet. He's going to shortly. They're clearing it out for him.
Okay.
So, Congressman, how is this a good day for? How did this turn out? It was a very contentious hearing or meeting yesterday, but eventually these moved out of the committee. So, what can you describe what this means?
Well, we voted 23-17 to approve 2 articles of impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors against President Trump. So those articles will be advanced to the floor of the House of Representatives, presumably next week.
So, yeah. So, how important is this for the American public?
Well, the misconduct of the president raised in these 2 articles is of urgent importance to the American people because they describe not just high crimes and misdemeanors, but a crime in progress. This president has worked to drag a foreign government into our election. Meantime, he's invited another foreign government, China, to get involved in this election, and this is on a pattern going back to 2016 where he invited Russia to be involved in the election on his behalf. There's nothing more precious in our country than our voting rights and democratic self-government. And democratic self-government is put at risk by a president who insists on dragging foreign powers into our elections. And so the first article of impeachment is about abuse of power. The president bringing a foreign power into our election in order to advance his own interests over the interests of the people, our national security, and the Constitution. In the second article is about obstructing Congress in the investigation into the president's misconduct.
Are you worried that this is doing more damage to Joe Biden, who's the leading presidential contender?
That is no consideration of ours at all. We are not engaged in political considerations. We are engaged in constitutional considerations. We are defending the Constitution and we are defending the integrity of the 2020 presidential election. If we let the president get away with this misconduct, it means that every president for all time will be able to bring foreign powers into our elections using federal tax dollars to pressure foreign governments to get involved in our elections. And that's totally antithetical to the constitutional design. It's the opposite of what the framers wanted for us. The framers wanted a government that really was of the people, by the people, for the people. The elections belong to the people, not to the president. Because the government belongs to the people, not to the president. It's not the private property of the president.
What about what McConnell said last night on Fox News about how he is working hand in hand with the government's, or with the president's attorneys?
Well, I wanted to see it for my own eyes because I couldn't believe it when I was told that Senator McConnell had said that the Senate is working directly with the White House to set up the rules that they want. That is a complete surrender of the constitutional duties and prerogatives of the Senate, essentially turning them over to the White House. The way that the Constitution is arranged is this. The House of Representatives acts like a prosecutor. It assembles the evidence, and we have done that meticulously here, of obstruction of justice and of abuse of power, and then we send it to the Senate. At that point, the Senate conducts a trial under its own rules, under its own procedures. But I suppose, just as Senator McConnell has said, he's not going to vote on any legislation that the president doesn't want. Now he says he's going to conduct the impeachment trial in consultation with the defendant in the case.
So is the Senate process already rigged?
Well, let's hope that there's sufficient clamor within the Senate and within the country to make him rethink this idea of coordinating strategy with the defendant in the case. The president is essentially a constitutional defendant, and he's a defendant because we have voted to send an indictment articles of impeachment to the Senate because of the high crimes and misdemeanors he's committed.
The votes were just 7 minutes. Why not just do this last night?
Well, the chairman will discuss all of that.
Was it a stunt?
No, we absolutely was not. We clearly didn't want to vote in the middle of the night. I favor voting in broad daylight now, so it wouldn't be said that the Republicans had delayed voting in the middle of the night in order to vote. But please listen to Chairman Nadler about that. It's much more to what was happening.
Sir, are you concerned that this is going to be a party line vote when you take it to the House floor? After 3 months of investigations, doesn't that make it inherently political?
Let's see. First of all, we know it's not going to be a party line vote because, at least I'm very hopeful that Justin Amash, who now represents millions of independents across the country because he's the only independent in the House of Representatives, voted for the impeachment inquiry and has been very skeptical of the president's constitutional misconduct. So I think that at least we will have Democrats and independents, but I'm hopeful that there are Republicans out there who will consult their conscience and consult the Constitution and will keep an open mind about how to vote. And we've got to believe that that's how the process is going to work.
Thank you. Here you go. Thank you.
So this was a party line vote. What's going to happen?
Heads up! Heads up! Guys, step back, stay back.
Okay. Today is a solemn and sad day. For the third time in a little over a century and a half, the House Judiciary Committee has voted articles of impeachment against the President for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The House will act expeditiously. Thank you.